From June 28 through August 5 I guarded merchant ships in the Tokyo Bay area. This easy assignment gave me a welcome opportunity to train my new crew. There is no doubt that Yamamoto's withdrawal of the combined fleet to Japan waters at this time was a grave blunder. Most of the combined fleet should have been kept in Truk. Yet Yamamoto's strategy was not entirely without merit. Most of his 104 destroyers got respite and the training which was greatly needed. All these destroyers would soon be engaged in a series of intense, fierce battles lasting for more than 2 years. In these battles, destroyers assumed a leading role for the first time and probably for the last time in history. Another great blunder was the piecemeal of commitment of destroyers in the Solomons, usually without help of planes or larger warships. Yet they fought gallantly against all odds. In addition to fighting, they also transported troops. The destroyers of the celebrated Tokyo Express were the real workhorses of the South Pacific. Attrition was high. From the start of the U.S. Guadalcanal operation on August 7, 1942, to the Japanese Dunkirk from that island on February 7, 1943, 12 Japanese destroyers were sunk. I took part in the continuing operations in Solomon's waters from March through November 1943, in command of destroyer Shiger. Losses were higher than in the previous 6 months owing to the enemy's growing air supremacy and improved radar. My ship was the only one in the Tokyo Express to survive these battles without losing a man. Some 30 other Japanese destroyers were sunk in this period. Japanese Navy people called Shiger Autumn Rain the Ghost Destroyer or the Destroyer Indestructible, and I was nicknamed the Miracle Captain. That was indeed the most glorious period of my career. An old Chinese proverb says a lion uses all its might in attacking a rabbit. The American Navy acted exactly like this lion when it stormed Guadalcanal and Tulagi at daybreak on August 7, 1942. Ironically, the Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal had just been completed the previous day. Guadalcanal was occupied by 2,600 Japanese construction workers and defended by only 800 Navy troops equipped with a few artillery pieces and some machine guns. The Japanese air strength consisted of only 9 float fighters and 12 unarmed flying boats. The Americans annihilated the Japanese at Tulagi in 2 hours, and 1 battalion perished on Guadalcanal as quickly. At the time the Japanese the combined fleet was fast asleep 2,700 miles away in Japan's inland sea. But Yamamoto had a watchdog at Rabaul, 560 miles northeast of Guadalcanal, in Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet. Mikawa's force, comprising 5 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers and 1 destroyer, steamed out of Rabaul at 15:30 on August 7 and stormed the American invaders at midnight of the 8th. Mikawa's ships sank 4 American and Australian heavy cruisers, and damaged 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers in a 30-minute battle. Mikawa's only loss was cruiser Kako, sunk 2 days later by submarine S-44 as his ships were nearing Caveing, New Ireland. Mikawa achieved one of the most brilliant surface victories of the war. He erred, however, in failing to attack any of the supply-laden transports of Guadalcanal. Mikawa has been sharply criticized for this blunder by both Americans and Japanese after the war. It is my belief, however, that Mikawa fulfilled his watchdog assignment. The real blame must rest with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who held his combined fleet in home waters. When the American invasion was reported to Japan, the lion pricked its ears, but did not rise. Emperor Hirohito, vacationing at his summer villa in Nikko, upon hearing the news, said he would return to Tokyo immediately, but Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, went directly to Nikko for an audience. "Your Majesty, it is nothing worthy of your Majesty's attention," Nagano explained. He flashed an intelligence report from the Japanese military attaché in Moscow claiming that the enemy had only 2,000 troops at Guadalcanal, and that their plan was simply to destroy the airfields and withdraw from the islands. It is not known how this stupid intelligence report was obtained. But even more stupid were the high-ranking officers who must have ignored the many other intelligence reports. Finally, on August 10, 3 days after the operation started, the 5,800 midweight troops standing by at Truk were ordered to Guadalcanal by Imperial General Headquarters. The Yamamoto Lion had closed its eyes again after hearing of Mikawa's phenomenal win, and it slowly arose only after learning of the IGHQ order. The next day, August 11, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's Second Fleet was detached from Combined Fleet for the 2,700-mile voyage to Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stalled, saying that his new pilots were not yet ready, but, under prodding, he did have his ships ready to sortie with Yamamoto's main force on August 16. By that time American forces were firmly ashore on Guadalcanal. Last-minute changes put my ship, Amatsukaze, under the command of my old friend Nagumo. Amatsukaze and 14 destroyers were assembled into Destroyer Squadron 10, around cruiser Nagara, Nagumo's flagship since the sinking of Akagi at Midway. The squadron was commanded by Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura, a destroyer expert. We went south at an easy 18-20 knots. These destroyers were all capable of 33 knots, but high speed increased fuel consumption tremendously. Our schedule was to reach Truk around August 20, covering 2,000 miles in 5 days. Thence we would advance to Guadalcanal. Halfway to Truk we learned of another Japanese blunder committed at Guadalcanal. On the night of August 18, 6 Japanese destroyers had landed 800 lightly equipped troops on the eastern coast of Guadalcanal. Apparently no one in the Japanese high command realized that the Americans had already poured some 20,000 well-equipped Marines into the island. The Japanese troops made a dogged advance through the jungle, only to be trapped 2 days later by the Americans in a mass slaughter. Fewer than 200 Japanese survived the onslaught and they fled in utter disorder. The news shook Yamamoto. He immediately called off the scheduled stopover at Truk and ordered the fleet to rush directly to Guadalcanal. Belatedly Yamamoto had come to his senses. But the army command clung to the myth that the invincible Japanese could shatter outnumbering enemy forces by their aggressive spirit. After the collapse of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 1st Regiment, the army decided this time to throw in a brigade. This force, commanded by Major General Seiken Kawaguchi, was also defeated. But it was still a long time before the army could decide to put a full division into the effort. Yamamoto's complacency was completely shaken on August 20. That morning, a patrol plane searching about 500 miles west of Bougainville had sighted an enemy task force, at least 1 carrier, 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers heading north at 14 knots. Yamamoto had cancelled the stop at Truk, but practically all ships were low on fuel. We had to refuel at sea from tankers before continuing our advance. Refueling at sea is always a hazardous and nerve-wracking operation, especially so in time of war. Both tanker and warship must slow to 6 knots, and several destroyers must patrol lest enemy subs or planes attack this tempting target. On this occasion our refueling took so long that it was 4 on the 23rd before we arrived in position 400 miles north of Guadalcanal. 2 transports carrying another 1,500 troops under Colonel Ichiki, escorted by 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron II, were 50 miles ahead of us. The plan was for half of Ichiki's vanguard troops to assault Guadalcanal, followed by the other half after the first force had been landed. Additional support troops would be provided by the Kawaguchi Brigade, whose convoy had left from Truk. On the morning of August 23, Destroyer Squadron 2 reported that its ships had been spotted by enemy patrol planes, and Admiral Yamamoto was thus confronted with a problem. The most appropriate solution would have been to cancel the scheduled landing operations and engage in a decisive naval action. Yamamoto, however, ordered Destroyer Squadron 2 convoy with its Ichiki troops to reverse course just for a day, and he gave no orders to the Kawaguchi convoy. He had decided to knock out the small American task force and then continue with the scheduled landing operation. Some explanations are required here to explain Yamamoto's decision, bearing in mind that hindsight judgments can never appreciate the burdens of an on-the-spot decision. Since the China War, it had been traditional for the Army to take the initiative and the Navy to follow suit. It was the Army's idea to land a battalion first, then the remainder of the regiment and then a brigade. To demand that the Army revamp this idea would have been to break with tradition. If Yamamoto had known the strength of the enemy on Guadalcanal, he would undoubtedly have taken the bold step and ignored the tradition. But somehow the facts of the situation failed to reach him. His prime concern was for the troops holding a beachhead on the east coast of Guadalcanal. Their annihilation seemed to be only a matter of time. Something had to be done to prevent the loss of this beachhead. Yamamoto hastily formed a diversionary force of 10,150-ton Ryujo, the smallest combined fleet carrier, heavy cruiser tone, and destroyers Tokutsukaze and Amatsukaze. This four-ship unit, led by Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, was to storm Guadalcanal and draw off the American task force reported heading toward Bougainville. The Nagumo task force with its nucleus of two 40,000-ton carriers was directed to turn northeastward and flank the enemy ships as they pursued Admiral Hara's decoy force. We set off at 0200 on the 24th with 13,320-ton Tone, a weird-looking ship with all of its 8 6-inch main guns mounted on the bow deck in the lead. Ryujo followed, flanked by Amatsukaze to starboard and our sister ship Tokutsukaze to port. We dashed toward Guadalcanal at 26 knots. The assignment was not an easy one, but it was my first really important mission of the war. My muscles twitched with excitement as I stood on the bridge. Admiral Hara, in Tone, was one of the Navy's most brilliant leaders. I had known him since my academy days when he had been an instructor, and I had full trust in him. Hara had led one carrier division of the Nagumo task force when it hit Pearl Harbor. The big concern was Ryujo. Whenever I looked at this 10-year-old carrier I got uneasy. The best pilots were never assigned to older ships, and, after losing so many crack flyers at Midway, I was positive that Ryujo's aviators were sadly inexperienced. I brooded over how this decoy would survive its first acid test in the war. At 7:13, as day dawned on the South Pacific Ocean, the first enemy contact was made with a Navy float plane. It followed us for many miles but finally turned away, evidently with enough information about our strength. I groaned. We went ahead according to schedule for 4 uneasy hours without sight of any more enemy planes. The sea was extremely calm. The sun shone intermittently through thick clouds. The weather, favorable for attacking aircraft, recalled memories of Midway. What a bad day, I thought. At 11 we were 200 miles north of Guadalcanal. 6 bombers and 15 fighters zoomed up from Ryujo and headed for the island exactly on schedule. When Ryujo turned westward toward its rendezvous with these planes, my ship swung to port, keeping 2,000 meters from the carrier. I knew that the 21 planes sent off were not the ship's full complement, and wondered why Ryujo did not fly its 9 remaining fighters as air cover. Looking at the cloud banks I speculated on how enemy planes might spill out of them at any moment to deal a fatal blow at the vulnerable carrier, just as at Midway. Gradually I became more and more irritated. Another hour passed, and still no more fighters from Ryujo. I simply could not understand it, and mumbled angrily to myself. At 12:30 the tube from the radio room brought an excited voice. "Commander, a message from a Ryujo plane says that the Guadalcanal bombing was successful." I sighed in relief, but wondered just how effective only 6 bombers could be. I started to eat lunch which had been brought to me on the bridge. I had just finished eating when I heard one of the lookouts call, "A plane. Looks like the enemy, coming from 30 degrees to port." Through binoculars I saw an enemy plane rambling leisurely in the distance, slipping in and out of the clouds. Signal flags went up, ship whistles blew, and guns were raised for anti-aircraft firing. As the plane approached, another emerged from the clouds. They appeared to be B-17 flying fortresses, like our old friends at Davao. I turned toward Ryujo and stared open-mouthed. All was so quiet and serene on board the carrier that I thought the skipper must be asleep. To alert Ryujo, I told my gunners to open fire, although the enemy bombers were still out of range. Tone and Tokutsukaze immediately followed suit. At last 2 fighters zoomed up from Ryujo. The enemy planes turned tail, their reconnaissance completed. Our fighters climbed rapidly, but when they reached the enemy altitude, the B-17s had vanished into the clouds. The fighters came back and circled slowly over their carrier. My patience ended. I was worried and furious. Ryujo would be helpless against enemy planes which might appear in strength at any moment. I jotted a note and called my signal officer. "Send this message to Ryujo by semaphore at once." A signalman ran up and briskly waved his flags, from Commander Tameichi Hara, Amatsukaze C. O. to Commander Hisakichi Kishi, Ryujo exec. Fully realizing my impertinence, I'm forced to advise you my impression. Your flight operations are far short of expectations. What is the matter? The message was probably rude and certainly audacious. I do not know of any other Japanese naval officer who sent such a message during an operation. I addressed the message to Kishi because we had been classmates at Adajima. He was not responsible for flight operations, but my intention was to awaken the skipper and flight officer who were responsible. Wondering what Kishi's reaction would be, I stared at the carrier and saw an answering signal. From Kishi to Commander Hara. Deeply appreciate your admonition. We shall do better and count on your cooperation. Ryujo's action response was prompt. 7 more fighters quickly appeared on deck. Their propellers went into action almost instantly, but they were too late, for at that moment my lookouts shouted, "Many enemy planes approaching." It was about 1400 and Ryujo was turning into the wind to launch aircraft when scores of American dive bombers attacked. I watched Ryujo anxiously. Other Japanese carriers could clear their decks of readied fighters in a matter of a few minutes. But not Ryujo. I had many other things to do. My ship was moving out to a 5,000-meter distance from Ryujo, just as were Tone and Tokutsukaze, to fight the oncoming enemy planes. Ryujo radioed the 21 planes which had struck Guadalcanal, ordering them to go to Buka, midway between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, instead of returning to the carrier. Why did not it call back some of these 15 fighters for interception? I had no more time to speculate. The enemy SBD Dauntless bombers and Grumman fighters were pouncing on the sluggish carrier. At least 24 American bombers spilled their deadly charges around Ryujo, and fighters swooped low over the ship, machine gunning everything in sight. Ryujo's 12 anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically without downing any of the attackers. 2 or 3 enemy bombs hit the ship near the stern, piercing the flight deck. Scarlet flames shot up from the holes. Ominous explosions followed in rapid order. Several more bombs made direct hits. Water pillars surrounded the carrier, and it was engulfed in thick, black smoke. This was no deliberate smokescreen. Her fuel tanks had been hit and set afire. Was she sinking? Had she sunk? The enemy planes now turned from the carrier and headed against the other 3 of us. All guns opened fire as the planes swooped on us. My ship was making 33 knots and zigzagging frantically. Tremendous bow waves kicked up by the speeding destroyer drenched me on the bridge. Amatsukaze weathered the 30-minute attack. Some of the bombers had saved their eggs for us. None hit my ship, but there were several near misses. I breathed deeply as the enemy planes pulled away. Now I turned my eyes in the direction of Ryujo. The black smoke was beginning to dissipate, and the carrier emerged. Through binoculars I could see that Ryujo, in her death throes, had stopped all forward motion and was sinking. A heavy starboard list exposed her red belly. Waves washed her flight deck. It was a pathetic sight. Ryujo, no longer resembling a ship, was a huge stove, full of holes which belched eerie red flames. Flagship tone signaled, "Destroyers, stand by Ryujo for rescue operation." My ship immediately dashed toward the sinking carrier, but we were delayed when 3 planes appeared suddenly out of the clouds, causing general alarm. As they neared, they were identified as returning Zero fighters. They circled slowly over their sinking home, as if bidding it farewell. One of them came down slowly near my ship, trying to ditch. Amatsukaze obligingly slowed down. The other 2 planes ditched alongside Tokutsukaze. The 3 pilots were quickly rescued, but nothing could be done to save their planes. Precious time was lost in this rescue work. It seemed to me Ryujo would sink at any moment. But the burning carrier, despite its many gaping holes, miraculously stayed afloat. Even the eerie flames spurting from the hull subsided, possibly because of the thousands of tons of seawater flowing into her. Our hopes rose as Amatsukaze rushed to Ryujo's side. I recalled miraculous cases of effective damage control which enabled badly crippled ships to limp back for repairs. Our approach to Ryujo, however, was again suspended, this time by 2 B-17s which emerged from the clouds. The 2 destroyers and Tone had to resume speed for a zigzag run. All guns opened fire at the 2 bombers, which fortunately made only a half-hearted attack. Or perhaps they were simply too inexperienced to aim properly at fast-moving targets on the ocean. All their bombs were wasted. Dusk was approaching as the bombers departed and we resumed rescue operations. Thank God. Ryujo was still afloat, but without power. Maybe we could tow her to Truk for repair. My wishful optimism was shattered as we drew near. The fire had gutted everything. All weapons and facilities were destroyed. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The ship was listing some 40 degrees, and sinking visibly. Presently a man started waving signal flags, which read, "We are abandoning ship. Come alongside to rescue crew." We quickly moved in along Ryujo's submerging starboard deck. If the carrier sank as it could at any moment, Amatsukaze might be carried down with it. It was clearly no time for hesitation, and I decided to take a chance. The ocean, which had appeared calm, was actually rolling in long waves, causing the carrier's listing superstructure to pitch and brush frighteningly against the bridge of my little destroyer. Cold sweat ran down my back. Scores of strong seamen armed with long poles ran to the port side of my ship and held us off Ryujo. As long planks were set to link my ship with Ryujo, the wounded were helped and followed by the able-bodied who filed across to our ship, the officers carrying classified documents. The transfer was made very efficiently. More than 300 survivors boarded Amatsukaze. Ryujo's list suddenly increased steeply. It was sinking now. "Evacuation finished," I shouted. An officer at the end of the plank nodded and answered, "Yes, sir. Please cast off. It's getting dangerous." Amatsukaze's powerful turbines roared into action instantly. The destroyer responded quickly and moved desperately away. We had gone scarcely 500 meters when Ryujo disappeared among the waves. The tremendous whirlpool caused by its sinking made Amatsukaze bob like a cork. It was a close shave indeed. I was still breathing hard when a low voice behind me said, "Commander Hara, I do not know how to thank you." I turned around and saw Captain Tadao Kato, of Ryujo, the last man in the evacuation line. This was the man I had cursed so many times only a few hours ago. Kato, haggard and pathetic, bowed to me and croaked, "Please accept my humble thanks on behalf of my men." Suddenly I felt sorry for this general line officer, not a specialist, and my anger switched abruptly to Admiral Yamamoto, who had chosen such a man for a decoy mission. "You need not thank me, Captain Kato," I replied curtly. "You look ill. Are you hurt?" "No, Hara, not a bit. But so many of my men were lost, and the ship." Hands to face, he sobbed, no longer able to control himself. I feared he might collapse and called, "Orderly, quick, take Captain Kato to my cabin." "Oh, no, Hara," Kato protested. "Let me stay with my men, any place that won't bother your operation." I let him do as he pleased, since every inch of my ship was jammed with the rescued crew of Ryujo. I pitied the old captain as he trudged toward the ladder. "Captain Kato," I called, "just a moment. May I ask if my good friend Kishi, your exec, is safe?" Kato turned back speechless, his haggard face wrinkled with the pain of sorrow. I understood and nodded. Kato lowered his head and went below. I was stunned. My friend Kishi was dead. Kishi had a brilliant record as an aviation specialist. Had he been given a free hand by this line skipper from the beginning, things might have turned out better. I shook my head. There was still important work to be done. Morning had to wait until duties were completed. My ship joined Tokutsukaze and flagship Tone, and I was elated to find them unscathed like mine. They were still busy picking up some Ryujo crewmen who had jumped overboard. Meanwhile 14 Ryujo planes returned from the strike on Guadalcanal and circled overhead. 7, including the only radio-equipped one of the flight, were lost. The remainder, accordingly, did not know they had been ordered to land at Buka. They had to ditch and our 3 ships picked up the crews, but all the planes sank. The sun was setting as Tone, Tokutsukaze and Amatsukaze started eastward under orders from Nagumo to join his main task force. This day of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, August 24, 1942, had been a long one for me, and it was not yet over. After cruising some 50 miles toward our scheduled rendezvous, we observed a group of Japanese warships moving slowly to the south with their searchlights blazing. They were searching for pilots who had been forced to ditch. The night was black as pitch, the bombs and guns had been silent for hours, and I was beginning to feel the accumulated fatigue of a day-long battle following a sleepless night when these ships were sighted. I was thinking it would be good now to have a short nap when my signal officer reported that flagship Shokaku was blinking a signal to Amatsukaze. Admiral Nagumo directs Commander Hara to rescue 2 Zuikaku pilots adrift. Proceed at once to position Kien 21. I replied immediately, from Commander to Admiral Nagumo. Amatsukaze will proceed at once to Kien-21 and rescue Zuikaku's pilots. Turning to the charts, I checked the indicated grid position and whistled. Kien-21 was 98 miles almost due south of our present position, and it was within 60 miles of the enemy task force position as reported at the time of Ryujo's sinking. But orders were orders, and this was no time for hesitation. My drowsiness vanished and I summoned my staff for consultation. We could not afford to be off course by the slightest bit in this mission. I had no idea how the position of the pilots had been determined, but knew that our slim chance of rescuing them would be greatly reduced if there was any error in navigation. Admiral Nagumo had been so good to me that, knowing he had chosen me especially for this mission, I was determined to live up to his expectations. We were approaching what might well be the jaws of the lion, but my men were willing and eager and I was with them. 4 hours of running at 24 knots put us in the approximate area. I slowed Amatsukaze to 6 knots. With no stars visible, a sextant was of no use, so we had to rely on dead reckoning. When Ensign Hideo Shoji reported that we were in the designated grid position, I called all spare crewmen to stand lookout, announcing that whoever discovered the first clue leading to rescue of Zuikaku's pilots would be rewarded. The men ran enthusiastically to positions of vantage around the ship. Since there were Japanese pilots down in this vicinity, I had to assume that enemy pilots might also have ditched here and that they were also being looked for. Accordingly, I could not allow the use of searchlights which might draw attention to our position. Our destroyer, snailing along at 6 knots, was as vulnerable to submarine attack as an old transport. After half an hour of fruitless searching, I became concerned about our fuel supply. In addition to all the other factors that had to be considered, Amatsukaze had used much fuel in its decoy mission with Ryujo, and we still needed enough to reach Rabaul, 500 miles away. With this in mind, I ordered small running lights placed on the sideboards. Within minutes a sailor in the bow sang out, "Floating object to starboard. Looks like a bottle." I leaned from the bridge railing, saw the pop bottle reflecting the green running light, and shouted, "Good, they must be nearby." Cheered by this turn, I ordered a weak signal light from the bridge to blink the name of the pilot's ship, Zuikaku, Zuikaku. Another half hour passed and hope was waning when out of the darkness I saw a flick of a light off the port bow. It flickered again some 1,000 meters distant and went out, but this time I was sure. Turning in that direction, a boat was lowered from Amatsukaze when we had approached to within 100 meters and saw 2 men clinging to a raft. Ensign Hideo Shoji commanded the rescue boat. A blue shaded light was used to assist the operation and Shoji paused halfway to the raft to report back that the men looked like Americans. I grabbed binoculars for a close scrutiny. In the blue light they did look like Americans, but I ordered, "Rescue the men, whoever they are." My knees were shaking. If these men were Americans, it meant that our search must continue. But I was resolved to carry out my mission if it meant searching until dawn. As our boat reached the raft, a flashlight blinked that these were the Japanese we sought, and I breathed a sigh of great relief. With the men safely on board, we headed north at 24 knots, and I relaxed in a chair for the first time in many hours. Our rescue mission of the day was a complete success. Our decoy mission, on the other hand, had met a dismal end, and yet it had not been a failure. The sacrifice of Ryujo had deflected the enemy from the main Japanese force and permitted Admiral Nagumo to concentrate his full air strength against Enterprise. Still, the sinking of Ryujo as against the damaging of Enterprise was no advantage for Japan, since the latter carrier survived and was restored to service within 2 months. Furthermore, the U.S. Navy bombed the Ichiki convoy and damaged cruiser Jintsu, the escort flagship. 6 destroyers of the squadron closed Guadalcanal and bombarded it furiously during the night, but B-17s hit back the following morning and raked the ships for several hours. The convoy escaped to Bougainville, but not before destroyer Mutsuki had been sunk and transport Kinryu Maru sunk. Learning of the stiff opposition to be expected, the Kawaguchi convoy turned around and went back to Truk. Thus the whole of this second encounter in the Solomons ended in a Japanese defeat tactically and strategically. And Yamamoto's decision was proved wrong. 2 days after the operation, I heard an Imperial headquarters communique claiming that in the Battle of August 23–25, heavy damage had been inflicted on a large American carrier, medium damage to a medium American carrier and a Pennsylvania-class battleship. The communique admitted to the loss of only one Japanese destroyer sunk, and heavy damage to a small carrier. An American announcement said Saratoga's planes had bombed a Japanese carrier and damaged a cruiser and a destroyer. It admitted considerable damage to Enterprise, but went on to say that the Saratoga and Marine planes had also scored hits on a battleship and 2 cruisers. Ryujo had sunk before my very eyes, but none of the other 3 ships in our decoy force were even hit. American pilots apparently mistook transport Kinryu Maru for a battleship and destroyer Mutsuki for a cruiser. From that day on, I distrusted all war communiques, Japanese or enemy. When Amatsukaze rejoined the Nagumo task force around noon on August 25, I found new and pleasant orders waiting for me in the form of a message from carrier Shokaku. Admiral Nagumo congratulates Commander Hara for his fine, impressive job, and directs him to proceed immediately to Truk and land the rescued persons. Amatsukaze again broke away from the task force and steamed alone to Truk. We reached the calm of that atoll the following day. The Great Han Dynasty of China was founded by General Liu Pang in 202 BC. After he had emerged victorious from a series of many battles in a great civil war,